The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, together with the Optional Protocol and the International Covenant on Human Rights, collectively form the International Bill of Rights. It is important to note that the creation of the UDHR was only one piece of the UNCHR three-tiered mandate. In addition to a declaration of principles, the Commission was mandated with drafting two legally binding covenants. Now you hear that. Legally binding covenants on human rights. The International Covenants on Human Rights are treaties whose parties undertake to respect, ensure, and take steps for the full achievement of the wide range of rights. The two covenants are the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Both were adopted by the General Assembly and were opened for signature in December 1966, and both came into effect in 1976. The covenants recognize and define in more detail most of the rights set out in the Universal Declaration. The Optional Protocol is an adjunctant instrument to the covenant and was adopted in 1966 and came into effect in 1976. After the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Freedoms was drawn up, and the member nations agreed to this documentation and agreed that these are freedoms that should exist in all our countries around the world, there were two other covenants that were made after this. And they were drawn right out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Freedoms. And those two other covenants, they were drawn up to express and manifest our rights and freedoms in a profound way. So what we see in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Freedoms, well, these other two covenants, these other two documentations, they express those same rights, but in a more profound way, a more explanatory way. And it's binding. These documents here, these other two covenants, the signatories who sign upon those documents, they legally bound themselves. So in law they are legally bound to follow the principles and what is written within those documents. This is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This is where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights became legally binding to the states that signed this. Article 5. Nothing in the present covenant may be interpreted as implying for any state, group, or persons any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights or freedoms recognized herein, or at their limitation to a greater extent than is provided for in the present covenant. No restriction upon or derogation from any of the fundamental human rights recognized or existing in any country in virtue of law, conventions, regulations, or custom shall be admitted on the pretext that the present covenant does not recognize such rights, or that it recognizes them to a lesser extent. One of those two documentations that were drawn up, one of those two covenants that were drawn up, is called the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. That's the name and the title of this lawful documentation. Now, when you go into Article number 5, this is what it will state. It will state that this covenant that you're reading here, that it cannot remove any right or freedom that is a fundamental right or freedom that is already attached to you. And it says that other rights and freedoms that are not recognized in this covenant, that you still have the right of access to, apart from this covenant, if necessary. So we see that same operational law in Article 26 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It states in that charter that Canada recognizes certain rights and freedoms, and the other rights and freedoms that are not mentioned in this charter, that we have the ability to go and operate under them and go and claim them. So it's nice to see the same expression of law operating here, because it just keeps showing us through each and every one of their laws that indeed our rights and freedoms are available to us for us to go and claim them and get relief from all this garbage. Article 11. The states, parties to the present covenant, recognize the right of everyone, to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. The states parties will take appropriate steps to ensure the realization of this right, recognizing to this effect the essential importance of international cooperation based on free consent. In this secondary covenant that is flowing from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Freedoms, it states that in Article 11, that the states, the ones who signed to this covenant, they recognize the right of everyone. Now notice what designation they used in law there, of everyone. Not every person, but everyone, to an adequate standard of living for himself and for his family. The rest of that verse qualifies it even more. It says that you have the right including adequate food, adequate clothing, adequate housing, and you have the right to the continuous, look at these wordings, continuous improvement of your living condition. So you have a right to declare that my living condition should be continuously improving day by day. Just like a millionaire, for example, who keeps on making money and money and money, his living condition is continuously improving. Well, all of us have that right. And so one of our fundamental rights, one of our fundamental freedoms, we find them expressed in Article 11. That's concerning our right to life through food and clothing and housing. Because if we lack these elements, if we lack these provisions, we are going to die. That's for sure. Now, we have the right also to a continuous improvement of our living conditions. Very clear. They signed upon that document, they granted us that right. For allowing them to construct their commercial system. That's why all these rights are being expressed here. But that's for another video. Nevertheless, states will and must take measures to ensure the realization of those rights that are mentioned there. So they're under obligation to take the steps. And if they don't, and if they fail, and you bring it to them and notify them, well, they must take the steps. Not may, must. So as you saw, there's a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then there's those two other covenants that were formed after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that were signed. Now this makes three witnesses in laws. All three of these documentations, you're going to find the exact same operations in law, very clearly defined. That makes three witnesses, and in law, that's very powerful. You ever bring all this into a court of law, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Freedoms, Article 25, I'm sure, hopefully my viewers are aware of what that stipulates. It ties in, as you saw, with the covenant in Article number 11. Both declaring the same rights and freedoms that we have, that are there for us. Just declaring it more in the covenant, because the covenant now is saying, listen, the member states have an obligation, a legal obligation. So the government has a legal obligation now to ensure that those rights are being respected or fulfilled. And if not, then the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Freedoms, Article 25. Everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services.